Meister Eckhart. Meet Meister Eckhart, a 14th century Dominican monk, preacher, and philosopher from Germany who somehow managed to make Christianity sound like enlightenment training. He taught that God isn't just out there in the sky, God is inside you right now, deeper than thought. He called this inner spark the divine birth in the soul. In simple terms, you don't find God, you realize God's already what you are. Eckhart preached that to experience this truth, you must let go of everything, desires, fears, even your idea of God, until only pure stillness remains. He said, "The eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me." He was basically describing non-dual awareness 600 years before modern mindfulness. Of course, the church wasn't thrilled. His sermon sounded suspiciously like saying humans could become one with God, which was a theological red flag back then. He was accused of heresy and dragged before the Inquisition. He died before the verdict came out, but centuries later, the Vatican quietly stopped calling him a heretic. Today, Eckhart's teachings influence everyone from mystics to psychologists to Zen masters. His message was simple but radical. Stop looking for God, start being still enough to realize you've never been apart. Saint Teresa of Ávila. Imagine being so in love with God that you literally start levitating. That's Saint Teresa of Ávila, Spain's 16th century mystic nun, reformer, and spiritual firecracker. She grew up during the super strict Catholic Reform era, but didn't settle for just praying politely. Nah, Teresa wanted the full mystical experience. She'd slip into deep trances where she said an angel pierced her heart with a flaming spear of divine love. She described it as sweet agony. Teresa believed that the soul is like a castle with many inner rooms, and at the very center is the chamber where you meet God. She said most people wander around in the outer rooms distracted, half asleep, but true seekers go inward through prayer, silence, and surrender until they find divine union. Her mystical writings, especially The Interior Castle and The Way of Perfection, became spiritual classics. But the church, at first, not a fan. Her visions, ecstasies, and reforms made her look suspiciously un-nun-like. She was investigated for possible heresy, because back then being too holy could get you in trouble. Eventually, she was declared a doctor of the church, one of the few women ever to get that title. Today, she's remembered not just as a saint, but as a spiritual psychologist before psychology even existed, teaching that enlightenment isn't found in escape, but in going deep within your own soul until you hit the divine core. Hildegard of Bingen. She was a medieval nun who saw the universe as glowing wheels of fire and turned her visions into symphonies. She was one of the most brilliant and weirdly ahead of her time women in history. Born in 1098 in Germany, Hildegard started having intense visions of divine light as a child. She called this force the living light, and it filled her mind with images of swirling stars, human figures made of flame, and angelic geometry that looked like psychedelic mandalas. Instead of hiding it, she wrote it all down. Her books, Civias, Liber Divinorum Operum, and others were filled with these radiant visions mixed with theology, music, medicine, and science. Yep, she was also a composer, botanist, and healer. Her songs were so ethereal that people said they could open heaven. But here's the thing, Hildegard didn't fit the quiet nun stereotype. She preached publicly, wrote letters to popes and emperors, and even scolded corrupt priests. For a woman in the 1100s, that was basically breaking the matrix. The church was skeptical at first, but Pope Eugenius III eventually approved her visions. After that, she became one of medieval Europe's most famous holy women. Today, Hildegard is seen as a mystic polymath, blending religion, art, science, and cosmic mysticism centuries before any of those fields even had names. She proved that spirituality could be visionary, intellectual, and creative all at once. Thomas Merton. Meet Thomas Merton, the 20th century Trappist monk who basically became the bridge between Christianity, Buddhism, and modern mindfulness. He was born in 1915, a wild intellectual kid who loved art, jazz, and philosophy. But after years of chasing meaning in all the wrong places, he had a spiritual awakening that led him to become a monk at the Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky. From the outside, his life looked silent and boring. Strict vows, isolation, endless prayer. But inside, he was wrestling with God, ego, and enlightenment. Merton wrote over 70 books, and his most famous one, The Seven-Story Mountain, became a surprise bestseller. People were shocked that a man who gave up everything sounded happier and freer than the rest of modern society. The deeper he went into Christian contemplation, the more he began to see God in everything. In one famous moment, while standing on a street in Louisville, he suddenly felt a blinding realization. There is no way of telling people that they are all walking around shining like the sun. He started studying Zen Buddhism, Sufism, and Hindu philosophy, saying all mystical paths lead to the same divine source. The church wasn't sure how to feel about that. Some thought he'd gone too far, blending faiths, But Merton saw no contradiction. To him, silence, compassion, and presence were the real language of God. He died unexpectedly in 1968 while on a trip to Thailand to meet the Dalai Lama. Giordano Bruno. Giordano Bruno was a 16th century Dominican monk, philosopher, and mystic from Italy who thought way bigger than the world around him could handle. At a time when most people believed Earth was the center of everything, Bruno taught that the universe was infinite, filled with countless stars and planets, and that God's presence existed everywhere, not just in heaven or the church. He believed that every part of creation carried a spark of the divine, and that God wasn't a distant being sitting above the clouds, but the infinite life and intelligence inside all things. In other words, the universe itself was alive with God. Bruno's ideas connected science, religion, and mysticism. He blended Christian beliefs with philosophy, saying heaven and hell were more like states of the soul than physical places, but the church saw all that as dangerous. After years of preaching his views across Europe, he was arrested by the Inquisition, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake in 1600. Today, Giordano Bruno is remembered as a visionary thinker, someone who saw the universe as infinite long before telescopes could prove it, and who dared to say that divine truth was bigger than any doctrine. Marguerite Porete. Marguerite Porete was a French mystic from the 1200s who believed that a soul could become so united with God that it no longer needed rules, rituals, or even the church to guide it. She wrote a powerful book called The Mirror of Simple Souls, where she described how a person, through total love and surrender, could reach a state of pure union with the divine, what she called being a soul annihilated in God. In this state, she said, the soul acts only out of divine love, not out of fear, sin, or commandments. Basically, she taught that when you're fully merged with God, you're beyond spiritual rules, not because you're lawless, but because you become one with love itself. That sounded beautiful to mystics, but dangerous to church authorities. To them, it sounded like she was saying people could skip the church entirely. No priests, no confession, no hierarchy. So her book was banned, and she was accused of heresy. When questioned, Marguerite refused to renounce her writings. She stayed silent through her trial, saying the truth didn't need defending. In 1310, she was burned at the stake in Paris, holding firm to her vision of divine love until the end. Emanuel Swedenborg. Emanuel Swedenborg was an 18th century Swedish scientist, inventor, and theologian who basically went from studying physics and anatomy to exploring heaven and hell, literally. For most of his life, he was a respected scientist. He wrote books on engineering, anatomy, and astronomy, even predicted things like the structure of the brain before modern science caught up. But then, in his 50s, something strange happened. Swedenborg started having visions. He said God opened his spiritual eyes so he could see into the spirit world while still alive. From then on, he claimed to visit heaven and hell every night for nearly 30 years. He described meeting angels, spirits, and even people who had recently died. He said every person has both a physical and a spiritual body, and after death, we wake up in a world shaped by our inner loves and motives. He also taught that the Bible had hidden spiritual meanings, that God's love and wisdom fill the whole universe, and that heaven isn't a reward, it's simply what happens when your heart and soul are aligned with divine love. Of course, many people thought he was crazy, but others saw him as a Christian mystic who merged science with spirituality. His writings later inspired movements like the New Church and even influenced writers such as William Blake, Emerson, and Jung. Swedenborg died in 1772, calmly saying he'd soon pass into the company of angels. Joanna Southcott. Joanna Southcott was an English prophetess from the 1700s who claimed she was chosen by God to deliver messages about the end times, and things got really wild. She started out as a poor farm worker, but in her 40s, she began saying she could hear the voice of God and write down divine prophecies. She spoke about the coming of a new spiritual age, the defeat of evil, and the return of Christ. Not in some distant future, but soon. Joanna said she was the woman clothed with the sun from the book of Revelation, the mystical figure who brings forth a new era of divine peace. Her followers believed her completely. By her later years, she had over 100,000 devoted followers across England, but the most shocking part came in 1814 when, at age 64, Joanna announced she was pregnant with the new Messiah. She even said the baby would be a miraculous birth, a child sent to usher in God's kingdom on earth. Newspapers mocked her, the church dismissed her, but her followers waited for the divine child. When she died later that year, no child was ever found, and her movement split between those who lost faith and those who believed she would rise again. Even after her death, her followers sealed her writings inside a box called Joanna Southcott's Box of Prophecies, which according to her instructions could only be opened in a time of national crisis, with 24 bishops present. It's still unopened to this day.